The year is 1975, and on Cleveland's east side, a man has just ended his workday and is locking up his small convenience store. The man, Harold Franks, is well known to the community, with many of his members stopping by his small store to buy groceries, snacks, and even money orders. He locks up the small store, something he's done hundreds of times before, and prepares to leave when two men suddenly approach him at a fast clip. Throwing his hands up defensively and fearing he's about to be robbed, he tells the men he doesn't want any trouble. The attackers ignore him, and one immediately splashes a vial of hydrochloric acid on his face, blinding Franks and causing him to scream out in pain. The second man then pulls out a revolver and shoots Franks several times in the chest, killing him. The duo tear through Franks' pockets and manage to run away with $425 in cash, dashing to a getaway car waiting for them, which immediately speeds off into the night. That's the story of the tragic night's events according to the Cleveland police, who based their account on the events of a testimony of a 12-year-old paperboy who claimed to have been a witness to the crime. It doesn't take long for the boy to finger 18-year-old Ricky Jackson and his friends, brothers Wiley and Ronny Bridgman, as the culprits. But almost immediately, the young boy's testimony seems inconsistent, though that won't stop 3 different juries from convicting the 3 for the crime and sentencing them to death. Today, Ricky Jackson is 61 years old, and his original death sentence was commuted to a life sentence, which was only overturned in 2014. Back in 1975, though, Ricky was just a normal teenager with a bad back, who had joined the U.S. Marines hoping to make a career out of the military service. Unfortunately, his bad back caused him to receive an honorable discharge barely a year later, and thus Ricky found himself back in his familiar Cleveland streets the night of the murder. However, Ricky and his 2 friends have always said they were innocent of the crime, and to many, that fact was obvious from the start. For starters, after accusing Ricky and the 2 brothers as the killers in Frank's murder, then 12-year-old Eddie Vernon failed to identify the 3 boys from a police lineup. This is despite the fact that Vernon had claimed to have seen such specific details as Ricky being the one who fired the gun, Ronny Bridgman as having doused Franks with acid, while the other brother was the getaway driver. Those are incredibly specific details for a witness to give, only to then fail identifying the perpetrators in an actual police lineup. There's also the fact that many of Eddie's classmates testified that he had not been anywhere near the crime scene when the attack took place. For his part, Ricky claimed to have never even met Franks, and that he was somewhere else at the time of the attack. Unfortunately, Ricky didn't have a solid alibi in the form of solid witnesses, though that likely would have mattered little to a Cleveland police department hell-bent on pinning the murder on him and his friends. Despite the obvious incongruities in 12-year-old Eddie Vernon's story, the failure of the young kid to point out the men he claims to have seen committing the crime from a police lineup, a jury still found his testimony credible enough. The case was appealed, with yet another jury believing that Vernon was a credible witness. Ricky was thus sentenced to death and immediately incarcerated. As he would go on to say after his release, "The boy I was before prison, with all his dreams, all his intentions, he died the moment I was locked up." Ricky sat on death row for a year and a half until 1977. His death sentence was reduced to life in prison over a technicality. During his time on death row, Ricky said that what unnerved him the most was that there were people out there who legitimately wanted him to die, an especially hard blow for a man who knew that he was innocent all along. The next year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Ohio's capital punishment law was unconstitutional, and Ricky was transferred into regular population at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. At least now, Ricky would get to live his life in jail amongst other people, and not simply sit in his tiny cell with a single small window looking out to the outside. At first, Ricky spent his time in prison learning to grow up and adjust to hard prison life. He got into fights in order to protect himself and his meager belongings, and as a result, he ended up spending entire months at a time in solitary confinement. While he never found religion like so many other long-term prisoners, Ricky did say that the entire time he was locked up, he had what he called a small ember inside him, a smoldering piece of hope. This was something he refused to give up to the system that had already taken his life from him, and it helped Ricky to refocus on more positive things that he could spend his time doing. He started refereeing basketball games and took solace in the prison library. There, he would read entire books in a single day, engrossed in any subject available for him to read, from biology to nature to history. This was how Ricky's mind found freedom, and the only way he could escape the concrete walls of the prison he believed he would die in. Clinging on to that faint hope, though, Ricky began to write letters to anyone he thought might be interested in his case. He would write to journalists, filmmakers, writers, and activists, and his efforts paid off when in 2011, a Cleveland magazine published an article on Ricky and his sentencing. The article highlighted the implausibility of the testimony which had sealed his fate, and it struck a chord with members of the Cleveland community. One of those people to whom it struck a chord with was Eddie Vernon's pastor, the 12-year-old boy now a fully grown man. Speaking to Vernon about Ricky's plight, the pastor convinced Vernon to speak with lawyers from the Ohio Innocence Project, an agency dedicated to overturning wrongful convictions. Eddie Vernon would go on to rescind his original testimony and say that the police had intimidated and coerced him into fingering Jackson and the Bridgmans. Given the highly racially charged atmosphere of the mid-70s America, this was not an unlikely story, and fully supported by just how flimsy the original testimony had been and the fact that Vernon failed to identify the three boys from a police lineup after giving it. In 2014, state prosecutors agreed with Vernon and overturned the conviction, setting Ricky Jackson free after almost 4 decades of wrongful imprisonment. Ronny Bridgman had already been paroled back in 2003, and his brother Wiley had been paroled in 2002, but reincarcerated 3 months later for a parole violation. Prison had taken a toll on Wiley's mental health, and he had been unable to cope in the outside world. After getting out, Ricky Jackson focused on trying to build a life for himself with the time he had left. He found an apartment and got a driver's license, buying a used car from a friend. Then, with a group of friends, he started a business refurbishing homes around the Cleveland area. A few months later, the settlement money for his wrongful conviction finally came in, totaling just under $1 million, or less than $26,000 for every year he spent behind bars. With the money, Ricky was able to buy a home for himself and his fiancée, whom he had met through his niece. And a year later, though he had won additional compensation from the state to the tune of $2.65 million for lost wages over the time he had spent in prison, nothing could buy back the lost time. Ricky would go on to meet with Eddie Vernon and forgive him for his role in his imprisonment. Ricky told reporters that it was easy to forgive Vernon because he was just a kid at the time, and the real blame lay with the broken system, the lawyers, police, and the jury, which had happily accepted such flimsy evidence and locked the man away for 4 decades. In the end, Ricky Jackson may have gotten his freedom, but the money will never be enough to replace the life that is now lost to him. And hopefully his story will serve as a cautionary tale to the would-be jurors one day. How much do you think Ricky Jackson should have received for his time wasted in prison? Would you be willing to give up that much of your life for millions of dollars? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.